What's up, everybody? Welcome to the State of Wild, episode 45, a regular YouTube video web series podcast thingy. My name is Meowth, and as usual, I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Corbett and Roffle. How are you guys doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Coming off a good week, hit Legend with a very bad deck, and enjoying the very bottom of the NA Legend ladder right now.
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. Roffle, what was that bad deck? What was the, don't tease us like that. You gotta give us the full explanation here.
It was N'Zoth, Soul Fragment, Elise, Demon Hunter. I shuffled a whole bunch of Soul Fragments into my deck, summoned some Death Rattle minions to keep myself alive, and then turned those Soul Fragments into random legendaries with Elise.
Yeah, you know a deck is good when it has like 8 words before the class name.
Oh yeah, it's great keyword bait for YouTube.
True. Speaking of bait, you want to talk about the deck you hit rank 3 Legend with, Corbett? You know?
Oh yeah, I got
Ultimate
this
bait?
terrible deck from someone. This terrible deck sent my way, and then yeah, Reno N'Zoth Warlock from the Great Get Meowth. If you've heard of him. So yeah, I played that a bit, put that out on Twitter, trying out the new N'Zoth. We'll get into all the buffs and everything in a second.
You know, I actually gave that deck a shot at Dumpster Legend myself, and I had a pretty good like 8-0 streak with it. It just turns out that like anybody can queue that deck up and just farm wins with it. It's great.
We're just going to ignore the fact that I went 0-5 with it, okay? Yep. No.
Oh, well,
Anybody.
almost anybody. Yeah.
I'm not as good of a player as you guys, you know? That's
Yeah.
not my
That's
fault.
okay. That's all right.
But we've been alluding to a lot of stuff. You guys want to dump it? Let's jump into the actual episode. But before we get into all of that, just a reminder to leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you guys enjoy the content. It's a small thing, but it does actually support us a ton. But yeah, let's get into it. Earlier this week, lots of nerfs, even more buffs, 15 changes to cards. So let's touch on the nerfs first because, as usual, nerfs kind of have the bigger impact out of the two. And so in terms of nerfs, Refreshing Spring Water went from 4 mana to 5. First Day of School went from 0 mana to 1, but it gives you 3 minions instead of 2. So very similar to Twin Slice, where it was like a reworking of the card more than a straight nerf. Crab Rider. So Crab Rider, I think this nerf was actually super elegant. It went from being a 2 mana 1/4 with Rush and Wind Fury to a 2 mana 1/4 with Rush. As a battle cry, it gains Wind Fury. Mancrick, so Angry Mancrick, the thing that gets summoned when you pull the card from your deck, went from a 3/10 to a 3/7. And Hysteria, something that we, I guess I said we, but Corbett put out last week is maybe a little bit out there, going from 3 mana to 4. He was actually right, believe it or not. But let's go one by one. Let's talk about these nerfs. Refreshing Spring Water from 4 to 5. I mean, obviously it makes the card worse, but how much worse? Is it still playable? And what about APM Mage?
We went into a pretty deep discussion about APM Mage last week, and obviously one of its rather important cards getting worse is only going to make the deck worse. I think the card's still playable in Standard, at least. I don't know if you really want to be queuing up the deck or APM Mage in Wild, at least right now, like we discussed last week. I was kind of disappointed to see this as the option in Mage that get touched rather than in Cantor's Flow. I understand why they did it, because I don't think they wanted to over nerf Mage, and I think Ixar alluded to that in his Q&A as well. The problem is that like Incanter's Flow creates a lot of uncomfortable Keleseth-like scenarios where the mulligan win rate is just way too high for the card, regardless of how powerful the deck as a whole is. So a lot of the deck's strength kind of hinges on Incanter's Flow, both in Standard, where it's problematic, and in Wild. So I think it's a little bit disappointing not to see Incanter's Flow get touched, but I'm not going to, I guess, dismiss a Refreshing Spring Water nerf, because I think that was too strong of a card as it was to begin with.
Yeah, I think we'll probably see Flow to 3 eventually. Like, I wouldn't be shocked if that happens within like an expansion or two. But yeah, it's very reminiscent of like nerfs to things like Guardian Animals, where those were nerfs that kind of like, or Fungal Fortunes, the Druid draw card.
Mm-hmm.
When those kind of nerfs happened, then the classes in Standard kind of died off completely, where like they were just gone until the next expansion. And so I think that's what Flow would have done. And so I totally get it, like you said. It's something that I have seen as an adjustment is that there seems to be more people trying Mazaki Mage rather than APM, because the nerf is probably a little less affecting on that deck compared to APM Mage, which is sort of needs to pop off so much earlier with the apprentice and stuff because it doesn't have the as much stall as the Mizaki. So I've seen kind of that little transition. In addition to the fact that Mizaki's better into Dark Lair Warlock, which is now quite a quite a popular and good deck, popping up here and there.
Yeah, so two things. I want to say that I looked up the mulligan win rate for Incanter's Flow post nerf, right? So in this past week, the most played spell mage deck in standard, Incanter's Flow still has like a 10% higher win rate than the next best card, which was still Refreshing Springwater at 5 mana. So I do agree that it'll get nerfed sooner rather than later. And I don't think that it makes a huge deal in standard because or in wild rather, because of what you mentioned, that the deck is really not that good to begin with. And then touching on Corbette's point about Mizaki Mage, I went through a little bit of the same line of thinking for so I was playing APM Mage in my THL lineup this week, because I was targeting Reno Lock, and I queued into stuff like Pirate Warrior, and the nerf to Refreshing Springwater is very noticeable against aggro decks. It really slows you down by an entire turn, which you don't really have the ability to do. And so I think you either move to the Mizaki Mage build, or you kind of go back to the original builds that Corbett originally had with Ice Blocks and Ancient Mysteries, just to buy you a turn. I think it was either Paradox or Lurthos posted a list with of APM Mage with Ancient Mysteries, 1 Ice Block, 1 Duplicate, which is kind of interesting, allowing you to tempo out an Apprentice or a Waker early to try to stall the board, swing it back into your favor to buy you time, while still having the Duplicate to kind of keep the combo piece. So I do think that APM Mage has to go through a little bit of a rebuild, but I think ultimately the deck is still going to be fine. It's probably going to still be really, really popular because people enjoy playing it, even though it doesn't have the highest win rate. And so I don't expect the deck to go anywhere, even if it's getting a little bit worse.
Yeah, I think that's a good read on maybe people to transition into Mizaki Mage as well, just because it, you were just kind of playing, a lot of times in the Waker version, you want to play the Springwater towards the beginning of your pop-off turn, potentially to get that additional mana, to get those additional cards going, or as part of your combo turn if you have the Biscuit. Whereas Mizaki just kind of uses it as a really cheap draw spell and then does something else on top of that, generates additional spells, freezes the board, whatever the case may be. So it's a little bit less punishing for that. I think that's probably not a bad read for how to shift the deck moving forward.
All right, so the next nerf to talk about, nerf in quotation marks, first day of school. The nerf was from 0 mana to 1 mana, but we get 1 additional random 1 cost. And I want to read the dev comment here because I think first day of school got hit because it was such an absurd turn 1 play, right? Where you could play it and then play the 1 drop on turn 1. The dev comment here was, by bumping up first day of school's mana cost and the amount of 1 cost minions generated, removing the card to fit a value roll rather than its initial position as an efficient curve enabler. And I think that's what it does. I think the big thing is the only deck that this is really seeing play in was Handbuff Paladin. And Handbuff Paladin, I feel like, loves this change because it's 1 additional minion to buff with all your buffs and an additional minion, to rush into stuff with Broomstick. What are you guys' thoughts about this? I'm going to call it a rework. I'm not going to call it a nerf. But how good is this card still?
My intuition initially was that maybe makes it a little bit worse just because it reduces the speed, but hand buff a lot of times plays a value game in certain matchups, so it it's happy to hold another card in hand to get buffed. In standard in particular, I think the main problem with this card was 0 mana first day school, play the minion, buff it with Hand of It All the following turn. That's just not something that you do in hand buff Paladin, so you have that as a play, but it's rare that you take it just because you you want to lend preference to holding minions so that you can get them buffed with your Smuggler's Run or the Grime Street Boy. So I think that I haven't encountered the card enough or played it enough myself to determine whether or not it's better now, but I could see it being better or relatively similar in terms of power. I'll defer to you guys on this one if you have tested it out.
Yeah, it's so weird to think that it got better because it was already like the second best card in Hand Buff Paladin, behind Christology. But yeah, I think it got better. I think that it's so funny in that deck. I think it actually got stronger. Just because that extra resource is so valuable. I'm really surprised actually that they kind of, well, I guess yes and no. Like they made this change and it takes away the hand of a Dahl play, right? Which is the big concern in Paladin. So that makes sense. But at the same time, I'm surprised that they left it at this strong because of just how good Paladin has been in Standard. But yeah, in Wild, first day still like super busted in Hand Buff Pally, and I think it's actually good enough to just throw it in like Odd Pally as well. Like I think this is still like an excellent card in Odd Pally now, which it sort of works really well with the Broomstick stuff. It's just like a default curve filler, right? Like it means like on turn 4 you can always have like a 1-drop or a pair of 1-drops and hero power, things like that. I just think it's a really, really busted card at 1 mana, gain 3 resources. I just think it's really, really strong and is actually going to be like a new staple in all these Paladin decks, whether it's like Call to Arms Paladins or whatever. I think you just keep playing this. I think it's really, really busted still.
So my initial thought was 0 mana strong things. But then I did make the comparison for Hand Buff in particular. I did make the comparison to Christology, and that's just like a card you're fine playing. Yeah, it thins your deck of pulse cards, but like Hand Buff Paladin draws so many cards that it can run out of resources in certain matchups in certain games if it's not able to get across the finish line quickly enough. And then if you compare this card to a Christology, like the initial stat line of your minions does not matter all that much. There are very few 1-drops that are like actively bad. So everything that you get off of this, despite the wide range in Wild, is going to end up being a legitimate threat at some point. So
yeah, I've been playing a lot of Hand Buff Paladin actually the past couple of days because, like I said, I brought it to THL and I've been playing it on stream. And like the big thing is it does slow you down against stuff like Odd Demon Hunter and Pirate Warrior, right? Because you don't have that guaranteed 1-drop on 1. But in combination with buffs and Broomstick, it's just so much stronger, right? So if you can survive the turn 1, turn 2 and not completely get blown out, in combination with Broomstick, this card is just so much stronger. As well as like against lower decks like Reno Priest and Odd Warrior and stuff like that, just more things to pressure, right, that they have to answer, which is absurd. But yeah, I don't think that this is a nerf at all. I think it's just very, at least in Hand Buff Paladin, which was like the primary place that this was seeing play, I think it's strictly a buff. Alright, so the next card that got nerfed, let's talk about Crab Rider. Our crabby boy. Thank God it's nerfed. Thank goodness. Basically, the Wintry is being shifted to the battle cry rather than baseline stats. And so, reading the dev notes here, by changing Crab Rider's Wind Fury to only last until end of turn, we're pulling back on the lethality it possesses if left alone for a few turns. We aim for Crab Rider to still remain a solid option for decks looking to swing the board back, especially when combined with buffs. It's almost like Ixar might have had something to do with this because he's a hand buff fanatic, No, Crab Rider, I think, like I mentioned earlier, Call to Arms decks, you hate to see this change because now you're just pulling a 2-mana 1/4, and that's not good. But I think in stuff like Hand Buff Paladin or even Hand Buff Rush Warrior decks that can buff this card, I think it's still a very, very solid option for exactly what the dev comments state. Swinging the board back into your favor, right? So you play the first day of school on 1, they play Pirates, you play Crab Rider, clean up the board a little bit so that you buy yourself time, which I think is the big thing. It does make it a lot weaker, right? I'm really sad to see like Aggro Paladin get hit by this. Like, I'm really sad to see that because Crab Rider was like the only way you were ending games. But overall, I think this is a very healthy change, and I think like I mentioned earlier, pretty elegant change, and I'm very happy with what they eventually did to it.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised. I think everybody was just kind of expecting a stat line change, myself included. And this does, like you said, pretty elegantly solve the problem. It's a lot of text, but I think they've moved away from like shying away from, wordy cards like that. Especially, the problem with Crab Rider was that the same card that bought you the board back when you get behind also just ended up snowballing to a point where it won the game. So it served too many purposes, basically. Like, it could buy you the board back against an aggro mirror, or even, swing the board back after getting cleared against a control deck, and then at the same time receive buffs and kill the opponent. Like, that's just, a card shouldn't be able to do that. So this allows it to still buy the board back, but then it's just kind of a fair minion after that point without the Wind Fury moving forward.
Yeah, so that's a cool change. I love this one. I really didn't expect it. Always expected that 1-3 stat line, and this is much better. But RIP the Tax Paladin without like an actual win condition. It's kind of tough to see how like Tax Paladin is ever viable without the Krabby. It depended on that so much. But I think Call to Arms decks will be fine. I'm sure there'll be another way to abuse Weeblord and all the other good 2-drop stuff that you have there. It'll be tough though. You might need to find. You're gonna have to try and find something else that can actually like pressure and go for a different shell. But yeah, very happy with this change.
I had been toying around recently with bringing back Knife Jugglers, and I was like,
there we go.
That served a similar role, right? Basically, you want the Web Lords to lock out the opponents. You want maybe something that's sticky on board like an egg, but you do need something out of that Call to Arms that's going to make the opponent dead. And so, like, finding something in there is probably just what that deck is missing. If it's not in the collection right now, maybe future sets down the line will offer something similar, especially when cards like Conviction and Hand of It All are going to continue to exist for the time being, because noticeably absent from the list of nerfs was Conviction.
Yeah, do you want to touch on Conviction real quick? The fact that it didn't get changed, I don't think was surprising to a lot of standard players, but it might be really surprising to a lot of wild players. I think maybe the devs thought the combination of Crab Rider and First Day of School might tone back Hand Buff Paladin a little bit. That has not been my experience in the first 3 days of the post-patch meta, but I think a lot of wild players are very surprised to not see Conviction hit. Do you expect it to eventually get hit?
I'm not familiar enough with how it plays in Standard to answer that, but like I think the strength of it is not only that you can draw it so consistently off of Night of Anointment, but that it just plays so well into what the Paladin decks are trying to do in Wild right now. Odd Paladin goes wide, generates a lot of attackers, receives buffs really well. The same thing is true for Hand Buff because of the number of charge and rush minions that it has in there, so it's always going to have like willing recipients of those buffs, and like it's just kind of the nature of decks in Wild right now. I don't know its relative strength in Standard, but I imagine just based on the way they play, it's probably a good card, but not of the same quality that it is in Wild, and that's probably why it didn't get touched.
Next nerf was Mancrick, or Angry Mancrick, or Olgra, or whatever the name of the spell is. Going from a 3/10 when summoned to a 3/7. Pretty much what was predicted last week by our standard mastermind over here on the podcast, Corbett. Just more in line, easier to remove, right, when drawn on turn 4, turn 5. But yeah, I don't think this has a pretty significant impact in the WoW format. I don't know if you guys want to touch on this before you hop on to our last one.
No, I think we can move on.
Right.
Yeah,
not too big of a deal.
I just want to say kudos to Corbett for pretty much nailing it right completely with the exact nerf and the card getting nerfed. I think a lot of people were maybe suspecting something along these lines, but I mean, I think you got the stat line down even so.
Yeah, I didn't nail it all though. I was hell bent on the Ticketus nerf. Reddit got to me, man. Like Reddit threads, they seeped into my brain.
First mistake is going to Reddit. Come on. But
multiple misplay. Yeah,
terrible misplay. But yeah, instead of Ticketus, we actually got Hysteria. Hysteria going from 3 mana to 4. So Hysteria has been nerfed twice, up there for like Rogue Quest levels of nerfs now.
Yeah, fastest ever to get nerfed twice.
Yeah, and I'm really sad to see it get nerfed twice. I'm not gonna lie to you. Very sad that Hysteria is going from 3 mana to 4. I will go ahead and tell you now, it is still busted at 4 mana. I have gotten absolutely demolished by this card way too many times already in the past 3 days. Still a very, very good card at 4, but I mean, we can go ahead and transition this into Hysteria was the best counter to Darkglare Warlock, right? Up there for one of the best counters. And Darkglare, not getting hit by these 5 nerfs, right? And so Darkglare, already one of the best decks in the format, getting one of its best counters nerfed. I was really, really sad to see this one get hit.
Like it's still a good card, but the one turn, kind of like you talked about with the Springwater earlier, the one turn makes a big difference into a deck like Dark Glare. Priest is still probably paying 3 mana for this often, and it's still a good card at 4 mana. It's just like that one turn might matter in certain matchups, but still a high quality card. Like it probably warranted a nerf just based on the fact that with a mana increase, it's still pretty much an auto include, right?
Yep, still busted. Still really good. Very happy to see this one toned down a little bit. No qualms from me. Good to go.
No qualms from the Dark Lair player. I see how this is, right? That is getting
okay.
nerfed.
Yeah.
Am I wrong?
First,
though?
I get called out. First, I get called out for the Elucia change because I'm an APM mage player. Like I want Elucia change. All of a sudden, that's the reason. Yeah. Now I'm a Dark Lair main. Yeah. I know how it goes.
I don't understand your prediction on Ticketus then. Like, what are you playing that gets beat by Ticketus? Nothing gets beat by Ticketus.
Oh, yeah, true. No, that's the whole Reddit thing, though. Like, I just wasn't playing enough Standard, and they convinced me. They convinced me that it had to be OP.
All right, so those are our 5 nerfs, though. We've talked about the cards and the decks. I mean, you guys have both been playing a significant amount the past couple of days. So what do you think are the impacts of these nerfs on, the early post-nerf metagame? I know it's been like 3.5 days since this got nerfed. Do you sense a significant shift? Do decks feel significantly better or significantly worse?
I'm probably not the best person to ask, given that I'm playing so far in the dumpster. But like I've noticed a significant decrease in the number of APM mages that I face. That might be a result of the VS report as well that we talked about last week, and people realizing it's not a kind meta for it. I haven't seen many hand buff paladins either. I think it's just a tendency for people to avoid playing cards that have been nerfed simply because they've been nerfed. But I'm sure that based on what you're saying about the power level of those cards in those decks, people will probably go back to at least hand buff paladin a little bit more, and I'll probably start seeing that crop up more. Encountered a lot of people continuing to run Hysteria because it is a very good card, and I don't know, Murloc Shaman seems to still want Crab Rider, at least for that early game push, but it doesn't run away with games quite as much. So that's basically been my experience.
Yeah, I think everything's been very samey for the most part. There are kind of like 2 big things. One, like Tax Paladin. Like I said, that deck's dead now without Crab Rider. It can transition to something else maybe, or the Call to Arms, but the current iteration doesn't work anymore. And the Mazaki, like APM mages becoming Mazaki mages. Those are pretty much the only 2 things. Everything else is sort of, like I said, very, very samey. To the point where it's like, this is one of the least sort of impactful patches, I think, like relative to the amount of cards that got nerfed that do see play in our format, right? Like all these cards like popped up here and there, but less so Mankrik. But the other 4 are all very, very popular. And at the same time, these nerfs really just didn't do that much in terms of big changes. And I think it speaks to like how light some of these changes are, right? Like very much the current approach, the modern approach to the balancing team. Very, very light touches when they can. And the fact that all these cards were already insanely good to start with.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing is like, the APM mages, those that are still running APM mage, haven't changed. And the hand buff paladin list, I'm pretty sure you run the same 30 cards because it's like still the best list, and all those cards are still very, very strong. And like you're not cutting Hysteria from any of these decks that are originally running Hysteria. So like nothing has changed. I mean, my personal experience is I have seen a lot more Dark Glare because that was like the one deck that didn't get touched out of like the top decks, right? But I mean, I've seen a lot of Dark Glare, and I've seen like kind of a response like of hyper aggro to try to beat the Dark Glares, like a lot of cute lock and stuff like that. But in general, like you said, I don't think that this has affected the meta very much at all. Which, I mean, we don't really expect that to happen in Wild in most cases, but these were hitting cards in like the most popular decks, and I don't think it nudged the power level very drastically at all.
And like Corbett said, like it hit a high number of cards like that, and that's just the nerfs, and still relatively low impact in terms of its effect on the meta. Yeah.
All right, so the nerfs didn't do anything. Let's talk about these 10 buffs, guys. We got 10 buffs. That's insane. You might not even notice them because I don't think I've seen any of these see play yet in that format. But let's go through it. The first one is Razor Boar. So this is the Demon Hunter Death Rattle 2-drop. It went from a 2-mana 2/2 Death Rattle, summon a Death Rattle that costs 3 or less from your hand, to the same text but a 3/2. I mean, it's even. So yeah.
Yeah. And on top of that, like, the text of this card is like in conflict with the text of not only the 3-drop that follows the curve behind it, but also Death Speaker, because you don't want to put this card in the same deck as a Death Speaker. So your main payoff card is kind of in conflict with this card. So it's not the stat line that's the problem here. It's the words on the card. Like the fact that it has a Death Rattle means you probably don't want to play it in your Death Rattle Demon Hunter deck, because then you lose potential value off of your Big Bomb 7-drop. And in Wild in particular, if you're running its off in that deck, you're losing the 10-drop value as well. So it's just like it's not the stat line that was making this card unplayable.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Let's not talk about Razor Boar. It's kind of an irrelevant card.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Zanish. This is the Priest Legendary from Darkmoon Fairs, getting a big buff here. It's still a 5-mana 3/5. Big buff, right? It is now going to reduce the cost of all corrupt and corrupted cards in your hand and deck by 2. So this is a buff, but theoretically this is how it should have always been to begin with.
I've played this card in exactly one deck, and that was how I expected it to work, and I was confused when it didn't work that way, and then I stopped playing that deck because like it is more of a fix than like a buff. But also, the cards in that deck aren't good, so it's just like it doesn't really change.
Roffle, were you a Clown Priest gamer? Is that what was happening over there?
I was, and it was a disaster. Don't try it. I promise you, you don't want it.
All right. The next one, Unbound Elemental. So this is a card from Classic. Like, this card's like 8 years old. Finally getting buffed. It is now a 3-mana 3/4 instead of a 3-mana 2/4. Whenever you play a card with Overload, gain +1/+1. I can start off with a conversation about this one because I actually played a lot of this card in like an aggro Overload Shaman list. So the Tunnel Trog Totem Golem, Brucon, kind of nature spell damage list. Unbound Elemental actually felt really good in that deck because I was running stuff like Zaps and Lightning Bolts and what is it called? Storm's Wrath, the +1/+1 to everything.
Yep.
And it felt really good in that list. The problem is that list isn't very good, right? Like that archetype is just not good. But Unbound Elemental actually felt like worth playing, and it was worth its slot in that deck. I don't know if that means that Unbound Elemental still sucks because it felt good in a deck that sucked, or that the deck just, sucks as a whole. So,
honestly, to me, I look like the most relevant change because it's like a card that's almost been playable a few different times, but like, and that one extra stat line might make it relevant. Like you said, I played that deck too. It was okay. Like, it's not a strong contender for a deck, so it's unlikely to matter too much. If you get some more like low cost overload cards, it might become relevant. I can't see them printing something like Lightning Bloom ever again though, so it's not, I wouldn't count on it. But like, this is maybe the closest. I don't want to spoil the other ones, but this is probably maybe the closest we have to a relevant buff in this group.
Yeah, I think this moved from completely irrelevant to something to keep in the back of your mind as like new cards come out in expansions. We need to remember this card exists rather than just like completely forgetting about it forever.
Yeah, it's a spider tank with upside, but spider tanks tend to be a little bit slow in Wild. You can reduce its cost with things in Shaman, but like then you're playing those cards, and those cards are not good cards. So
I mean, we got a bunch of other Shaman buffs, so maybe Shaman actually gonna come back in the meta. Yeah, maybe. Let's start with Tidal Surge. Finally in line with the other Shadow Bolts of the format. From 4 mana with Lifesteal, deal 4 to a minion to 3 mana. Again, this is another card that probably should have been 3 mana the entire time to be in line with the other. Like, we have Devouring Plague, we have Shadow Bolt, we have all those kind of cards, and this is now in line with those. I don't know. I don't play Reno Shaman. Is this now like a good card in that deck? Maybe.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is good. Like, just solid. Not gonna be a needle mover or anything, but you're playing Reno Shaman, you need removal. Yeah, sure, it's pretty good.
Like you play Shadow Bolt, or you used to play Shadow Bolt in Reno Lock for a very long time, right? Shaman is some more hurting for removal spells than Warlock is right now, so I could see it sliding this in. Think about how wasn't the lifesteal of recent edition? How bad was this card like before that at 4 mana, deal 4, heal 4? Like that's like the scaling of lifesteal is what makes this potentially relevant, and like it didn't even have that for a very long time.
Yeah, I remember this did see like some incredibly fringe amount of play in standard, but it was always like when Shaman was at its weakest points and things like that.
It was desperation because you needed to fill out your
you needed
remaining
anything.
Yeah.
But no, it's actually solid, so it's not bad. But like, it's going in decks that aren't amazing. But yeah, I think this is fine. Devouring Plague is something that I kind of want to see more of in Wild. I think Wild players haven't picked up on that card enough. It's seeing a lot of play in Standard right now, is that the Priest, very similar effect. So I think the power level's there for this thing for sure.
What about the parallel of this one? I think this is a card that was already strong. It just didn't have strong support pieces. But it's getting buffed itself. Let's talk about Lilypad Lurker. Going from a 5-mana 4/5 with Hex, if you played an Elemental last turn, to a 5-mana 5/6. I mean, the stats, I feel like, don't really matter because you were... Like, this was a strong card if you were playing Elemental Shaman, right? This was one of your payoff cards. So, yeah, the stat buff is nice, but like you mentioned, with Tidal Surge, I don't think it's moving the needle on Elemental Shaman decks. I guess it makes it a little bit more aggressive, but Elemental Shaman decks as a whole aren't really on the aggressive side. So, I mean, I like the buff. It's a very, very strong card, but I don't think Elemental Shaman is, like, becoming more playable with this buff. I don't know if you guys have differing ideas.
I have a different idea in that my experience with this card prior to the buff has been the opposite, that it was not a powerful card. It felt really clunky to activate. When I did activate it, it didn't feel like it was doing all that much. A lot of people praised it as the savior for the Big Priest matchup, but like then they just summon a Blood Hoon and pull 6 minions from your deck and their deck and you're dead. So it's like I don't know, like yeah, you get a lot of value off of it, right? Because Hex is a 4-mana spell. But the effort involved in setting it up seems to be a little bit limiting, just to get some additional stats from it. And like the benefit to Hex tends to be should be with this type of stat line should be a tempo swing, but like that doesn't seem to be what Elemental Shaman excels at right now. So like, is the payoff worth the effort to activate it? Maybe because it's a vanilla minion that you can just throw out there to restart your elemental chain now as a 5-mana 5/6, but it didn't feel that way for me as a 5-mana 4/5, and even when I got the effect active, it didn't feel that great.
Yeah, I made up an Elemental Shaman deck, and it looked like it would have been an absolute tier 0 busted deck in 2017. Or it was the greatest arena deck of all time. Either or. But it really does look great if it was in Standard back in that era, but it just doesn't work out right now in Wild. I think the card is actually very solid. It compares to Rotnest Drake, the Hunt the Dragon, the 6/5 Destroyer minion. So it's very similar effect where it's the same total stats, same cost. Doesn't destroy, but it hexes, which is great. I don't know. I think this is enough where like eventually at some point maybe like this is a support piece for like Reno Elemental Shaman. Like I think this is there at that appropriate power level. It's just like obviously, it requires heavy support and the support isn't amazing right now in Wild. But yeah, I think this card's very solid and very, very good actually. Kind of in a vacuum.
Yeah, I think my big issue with like elementals when it comes to Shaman is like so much of the elemental support came from Unguro. And they were great in Unguro. Unguro was not great in 2021 Wild. And so building an Elemental Shaman, I'm like, wow, all right, I got Lilypad Lurker, I've got some Kalamos. Wait, I'm running Kalamos as my payoff card. And like you have Sandstorm Elemental, which is good. All right, let's say you're running Zeph. You have Cage Match Custodian. And then you have Lilypad Lurker. Those are like the 4, I feel like, insane Elemental cards.
How dare you disrespect Tar Creeper like this?
Yeah.
How dare you?
I mean, Tar Creeper was great in 2017. Tar Creeper not so great in 2021. So, like, I think Lilypad Lurker is fine. I just think that, like, It's forcing you to play elementals though, and elementals are just so garbage, right? Like as a tribe in our format, which feels really bad, right? It feels so bad to say that, but they're so bad in our format. And so like I think this buff is fine, but it's just not worth it, not worth it.
I mean, that tends to be true of a lot of like specific minion types. Mech decks have fallen off recently just because they're not getting support. One thing that like when you mentioned we haven't had elemental since Goro, the fact that they targeted this as a card, which kind of took people by surprise, could allude to the fact that maybe they're releasing some support for Elemental Shaman in the mini set. So, I mean, that's always a possibility, or even in future expansions. So, because it does seem kind of like a strange choice just out of the blue. So maybe that's some indication, or maybe it was just a card that they thought should have or should be played more often, and they want to kind of push the card's power level up a little bit to get it there.
That's a really good point, because like Tidal Surge and Unbound Elemental as like core cards, it makes sense that you want to buff them because they might be coming back next year and so on. And you kind of want to bring up the power level of the core set a little bit. Lilypad Liar, like you said, the fact that they chose this one particularly, in particular, means that it likely does mean that there's more support coming very, very soon. Which, I mean, maybe that's the boost the Shaman needs. It just gets that little nudge. That'd be exciting.
Yeah. Overall, though, I don't think any of these 3 Shaman changes make Shaman playable in our format outside of Murloc Shaman, unfortunately. I'm very surprised they didn't touch any of the Murlocs, given the fact that like Murloc Shaman is unplayable in Standard, and they printed like 12 new cards for that deck. I will say that. All right, let's move on to Warlock. We've talked too much about these Shaman cards that aren't going to have an impact. Let's talk about some Warlock cards that are also maybe not going to have any impact. Let's start with Deck of Chaos, because I know this was one that a lot of people were excited about. I totally didn't have this as like my top 5 cards in Dark Moon Fair. Couldn't be us. But with seeing 0 play, it is now 5 mana instead of 6, and is still seeing 0 play because the card sucks. Yeah.
You just can't draw it in time for it to be relevant. It doesn't matter if it's 5 or 6 mana if you don't draw it till like you're already on 10 mana and you've already cheated out the minions anyway. So like, what's the point?
God, I can't believe I was so off base. Like, it hurts to think about the fact that the card that I was like, oh yeah, top 5 has to be top 5 in the set. I was like over a mana off. like you need to discount this thing by 2 mana to even get it in the conversation. God, that hurts so bad.
It's not just you, okay? It's not just you. I had it up there as my favorite card. I had this as tier 1. I had a little bit of Pocket Galaxy syndrome, where I was so excited for this. I think what Warlock needs is it needs a Demon Caster. If you're holding a demon, cast a spell for free. Okay? 5 mana, 4/4.
I just think you put this to 4 mana. You just run this in even Warlock, right? We get 20 attack Molten Giants. I think that's the change needed.
I think the reason I never really considered this a real card is because in Wild, Voidcaller and Skull of Minari exist. So most of the demons or most of the minions that you would like see as relevant targets for Deck of Chaos would be Void Lord or things like that. Like they're already in play and not costing you 6 mana in an entire turn. So that's the limiting factor. It's not even just that the card's bad. It's that the card's bad and you have better options to get big minions in play.
Rolf was rubbing it in that he was smarter than us, dude. He was just rubbing it in.
All right.
It's a lunatic secret mage all over again.
Yeah, true.
Yes, actually, yeah.
But let's talk about one that might actually be relevant. Let's talk about Fiendish Circle. So Fiendish Circle is a 4 mana spell, summon 4/1/1 imps. It is now a 3 mana spell, summon 4/1/1 imps. So this is a buff to everybody's favorite deck, Darkest Hour. Ruffle's eyes just got big when I said that. But outside of Darkest Hour and White Delight, who's the only person that plays that deck, I mean, I've seen experimentation with this deck in Cute Lock, but I'm interested in your opinions outside of the Darkest Hour on this card.
I think you should avoid running this card in Cute Lock at all costs because it messes up your Bone Web Egg discards. I think that, it maybe is relevant in Darkest Hour, but that deck is not a real thing because you have to like stick a board now that Blood Bloom costs a reasonable amount of mana. So it's like I don't see that as a legitimate inclusion. So I don't like, maybe this sees play in standard, but I don't think its mana cost was again the limiting factor here. It's just kind of it's a fact. Like there's currently not much use for this in a format that's as fast as Wild.
Yeah, I think this is actually quite solid, right? Like 4 tokens for 3 mana. I think that there's no home for it right now. Unless you want to go play your bastardized version of Darkest Hour. Not that I did so at all. But like I think like if there's a deck that really wants to push wide that isn't token, that isn't cute lock. So something that does want to use the Wicked Whispers, Grim Rally package. Like I don't know, something that's like the more like token buff support you get, that makes sense to include like a heavier card like this. I think this is a really good one to have in the back pocket, kind of like Unbound Elemental, right? I think it's just like there as a solid option now as future stuff comes out, even if there's no home for it right now. It's a lot of tokens, like 4 tokens for 3 mana. It's like a lot.
Right. There's a Murloc spell that does the same thing at 4 mana. Like a mana reduction, a full mana reduction is, pretty impactful. Just as a full mana increase is pretty impactful. I just don't see a home for it right now.
Yeah, I will say that, Roffle brought this up earlier, and I kind of just want to reapply it to Fiend's Circle. Fiend's Circle being in the core set, not really fitting any kind of current wild decks. This getting a buff here might indicate to something that they might be pushing in the mini set or in future expansions. So just something to keep an eye out on. But yeah, Warlock not really getting hit with any of these buffs. Let's move on to Warrior. Whirling Combatant. I had never seen this card before until I saw it here in the buff patch notes. It's a 4-mana 2/6 with Battlecry and Frenzy. Deal 1 damage to all other minions. Is now a 4-mana 3/6 with Battlecry and Frenzy. Deal 1 damage to all minions. When we have seen changes like this in the past, they have been irrelevant. This card was nowhere close to being well playable, I feel like. And so I don't think this is going to do anything. I don't know if you guys disagree.
Wild has Risky Skipper, and the card, again, like the stat line isn't why you're playing it, and in particular, the attack is not why you're playing it. So, like, if anything, maybe a health buff might have helped it a little bit more so that it's likely to survive the Frenzy. It's already got a pretty big caboose anyway, so maybe it just, like, trades more favorably, but again, you already have more than enough Whirlwind activators in your decks that would want to run them. So I saw this played like once in early Dead Man's Hand against me when the set first released, and it was not good.
Yep, nothing to add. Next.
Okay, can we also talk about, I know we're going a little bit long on just like nerfs and buffs, but Frenzy was the mechanic here for Forged in the Barrens. Wasn't seeing a ton of play, and this was like the only card that got buffed that had Frenzy. Was interesting. I was expecting a lot more here. Maybe there is a lot of support coming in the mini set. But I don't know, Corbett's probably looking it up right now. I don't know if there are very many Frenzy cards that are seeing play in standard at all.
Yeah, I was actually curious to just take a quick look, and there really aren't that many. Like, we have Samuru and Octobot. But apart from that, there's nothing that's really popping up. That said, there's something about like 13, and a lot of them are neutrals, which don't typically see a lot of play anyway. So yeah, like there isn't a ton, and some of them are impactful, but yeah.
Fair enough. All right, other Warrior buff. Shield made another 8-year-old card getting a facelift with the new metagame, going from its classic iconic 6-mana 5/5 Battlecry gain 5 to a 5-mana 5/5 Battlecry gain 5. Good in Odd Warrior. I think this is actually impactful. I think it's seeing play in Odd Warrior. It's not shifting the needle on Odd Warrior's matchup spread, but I have seen it played against me a ton. And also, it's just very fitting now that Odd Warrior, the armor-generating archetype in the format, now has access to the most iconic armor card of all time in Shield Maiden. So, outside of just like pure flavor reasons, which is a win, it feels like a slight buff to Odd Warrior, but again, like, it's not shifting any Odd Warrior matchups, so it's kind of irrelevant.
No, I'm super happy though about this one, just for like flavor reasons. I'm really satisfied that Odd Warrior gets to play the 5/5 that gains 5 armor. Like, it just looks right, It just feels good.
Well, it's just nostalgic too for like those early Hearthstone control Warrior mirrors. I'm surprised that it's making the cut in Odd Warrior. I don't know that I would have, been been too excited about shoving a 5-mana card into Odd Warrior in this
Yeah.
metagame. But I mean, people should play it and test it out and prove me wrong.
I've gotten beaten by a couple of Odd Warriors, both running Shield Maiden. So, in my small sample size, it's 100% win rate. The deck is broken with Shield Maiden in it. So,
in my experience, when you lose to Odd Warrior, it's because of the fact that you queued into an Odd Warrior, not necessarily because of the cards that they played, but because it was such a bad matchup for you.
well, in my case, shoutouts to Hazer, it's because he randomly generated a Boom Ship and pulled a Baku and 2 Shield Maidens out against me, playing Handbuff Paladin, and beat me that way. So, not necessarily the Odd Warrior, more Hazer's skill, you know.
I was going to say, yeah, that's just being good at Hearthstone.
All right, our last buff. This buff just it feels so weird to say that there's an old god now that does not cost 10 mana. N'Zoth, God of the Deep, is now a 9 mana 5/7 battlecry. Resurrect a friendly minion of each minion type. God, this like actually still hurts to look at and see that it's 9 mana. It looks so weird. I think the big reason it's 9 mana is now that you can play Broomstick, I guess, in combination with this. But like, why not just leave it 10 mana and default give the minions Rush or Taunt or something that makes it relevant?
I heard a lot of calls for giving it Rush by default. I feel like that would be really
It'd be
kind of boosted at standard. Yeah. Like, I think people consistently underestimate how strong Rush is as a mechanic in Hearthstone. Especially where you have a little bit more minion-based combat than in standard versus wild, but like it would just swing boards and control decks. It would be silly. But at the same time, I don't know. Like you mentioned, Broom, but if you're playing a 9-mana N'Zoth and a Broom, then you're not getting full value off of it. So, like, are you that much? Like, are you happy to give up 2 cards for something that's supposed to be your late game bomb just to like? Yeah, like I don't see the benefit to moving this to 9 mana. First of all, it breaks the old gods like trend of 10 mana. Second of all, like, are you ready for a N'Zoth on 9 mana? I've played this card a lot since it got unnerfed, and it's like I'm playing it on turn 10 plus anyway. So like, because I need to get enough things in the res pool to make it a relevant threat. So like, what does this do? I guess is my question. I'm a little bit baffled by it. Like, I want to see old gods changed. I don't know how you can do it without like either breaking them or like with Cthulhu, for instance, like, you know, putting it into your hand immediately would probably make it a little bit too strong in the current speed of standard. But it's clearly very too slow right now. How do you fix that? And same thing with N'Zoth. Like, the impact when he comes down is not the same as the old N'Zoth, and continues to not be the same as old N'Zoth. Changing its mana cost isn't changing that fact. I don't know what this change does.
Yeah, I really wasn't expecting a mana change because for all the feels good and all the nice feelings I get looking at Shield Maiden, as it is now, I get sort of yucked and grossed out by N'Zoth costing 9. Like, it just looks and feels wrong. But that said, they did have a lot of options, right? Like, we raised the idea of them buffing some of the old gods last episode. But things they could have gone for would be like give the minions taunt, if not rush, right? Like maybe instead of making it immediate impact, you give them taunt or something. You're often bringing back taunt minions anyway, it feels like. Maybe that lets you be a bit more diverse in the minions that you kind of get it at 10 mana, like the minions that you put in the pool. But they had options, and they put it at 9 mana. I don't know. Like, in terms of wild, does this like make it see play anywhere? Not really, right? Like, I can imagine Reno Lock, maybe it's optimal in Reno Lock to play it. I'm not sure. I've played a bit of that. It's kind of hard to tell. LPG is always kind of got this on the cards potentially. But I think the strength of it, I think it's good. Like, I think it can be... Again, it's one of these... another one of these cards which, like, it's so hard to judge because you need all this appropriate support around it, right? But I think the power level now is very, very good, even if it makes me feel kind of grossed out. And I think one turn can make a big difference. I think one turn in Wild can make a big difference, as long as there's a way to somehow get those minions in the pool quickly.
Right. Yeah, like, maybe I was just being too greedy, or as in matchups that dictated I hold it a little bit longer to get full value, but it just, like, I don't know if I came across a scenario where I'm just like, oh, it's turn 9. I get to jam this off now. Great. Like maybe that was just my limited experience, but it didn't feel like it was a noticeable change. And like even in something like LPG Mage, like you don't really want to pay full mana for it anyway. So it's like I don't know where this becomes relevant. But again, it could be something that does make it relevant in standard, just because you're happier to bring back early game minions because you have fewer options for late game bombs.
I mean, maybe it's the bomb in Odd Warrior. Like maybe that's like the best end goal for this at some point.
Do you? So I was going to bring that up because a lot of people have been talking about its playability in odd decks, but like, do you need or want a bomb in Odd Warrior? Like,
what are you even bringing back in Odd Warrior? Like, you have Max.
Well, maybe this is probably like way down the road.
Rebuild it. I've encountered somebody running like a Menagerie Odd Warrior, and like I don't see it as better than just like killing their stuff until they have more stuff or no more stuff, and then like bursting them down with cold lights. Like I think that tends to be what I perceive as the optimal Odd Warrior, and then the farther people get away from that, the worse the deck becomes in my experience.
Yeah,
I will say the biggest thing is that it gives you the option of playing it on 9 if you need it, right? Against something like, let's say, Odd Paladin or Hand Buff Paladin. The fact that you can play it on 9, I think, is extremely relevant. I like Corbett mentioned, though, it just feels like a lot of the support pieces aren't there, right? You're running the 3-mana 2/4 Quillboar. You're running Tarkeeper. You're running Ziliax, which is a great card. And those are, like, I feel like your staples. And then, like, but those aren't, like, enough of an impact, I feel like, off of your late game, supposed to be game-ending threat, right? And so it just feels like there's nothing to resurrect. I haven't messed around with it in LPG Mage. You brought it up. I played it in LPG Mage back like at the very beginning of Dark Moon Fair with like Mana Saber and Ziliax, and like Mana Saber is your beast. You have Ziliax. Now we have the Quillboar, the 2/4, and you have all the dragons in LPG Mage, right? Like maybe if it's an LPG Mage, but at that point, like I don't know, the dragons are already super greedy in this meta. Like I don't know if I want an Azoth in that list to begin with as well. So I don't know. I don't even think it's going to be optimal in Arena Lock. Like you have the demons, right? The demons to resurrect with this are great, except for the fact that you can potentially resurrect a Voidwalker like I did when I lost like 6 straight games with this deck. But I don't know. I know you guys have had success with it in Azoth Arena Lock, so I'm interested to see if it actually ends up being good. But yeah, it still just looks way too weird to me at 9 mana for me to call it a good buff. So.
Yeah, it just ended up being a third layer of threats in that deck. I think a good point is like alluding to the cards that you're bringing back. If you compare it to the cards that you're bringing back from the original N'Zoth, you have the ability to really like target specific good quality minions that you can bring back consistently, and you don't have to like fight for priority like you will with the different minion types in N'Zoth. So you can just like bring back some Sludge Belchers in the past, or more currently bring back a board full of Kartut Defenders. So it's like the limitation of the card makes it harder to find like the right support for it.
Would you guys have been interested? Do you think if this would have been playable at 10 mana if it said Battlecry Resurrect the highest cost friendly minion of each minion type, so that way you could target what you were resurrecting while not having to skimp on quality of other cards?
It would certainly like making a card better would make it better. That would reduce some of the limitation associated with it, right? Like you wouldn't get the Void Caller back. You could run different beasts while still managing, like you could it would make it better. I don't know if that would be enough to like make it a staple though.
Yeah, I still think that doesn't really address the problem with the card, where you're still fighting for like card slots to put in your Tar Creeper. It's not like running an extra elemental feels really great in addition to the Tar Creeper, just because sometimes you get to like hit the higher cost elemental, if that makes sense. So I really don't think that's necessarily the issue. I think that you probably just needed to make the minions that come back more threatening. Maybe they get all +2/+2. if something like that, right? So that way it's a bigger threat when it first comes down, things like that. Like I said, they had a lot of options, and the 9-mana one feels a little, I don't know. It'll take me a long time, lots of therapy to get over this one, I think.
All right, but I think in general, when it comes to the buffs, we're looking at Shield Maiden, right, as the only one out of the 10 cards that I think is going to see play in Wild, and it's not really that relevant because it's in Odd Warrior, but like it's not changing anything in Odd Warrior. So yeah, I mean overall, I feel like buffs super underwhelming, and nerfs. Yeah, they nerfed some really strong popular cards, but also not changing a lot. So as a whole, we got 15 card changes on Wednesday, and it doesn't feel like the format has really changed at all.
So the first part about like which cards got targeted in the patch, like that's fine. But it has happened that for whatever reason, the nerfs just didn't impact the format this time that much. The buffs, I really am like pretty bummed out about the buffs, I would say. I don't know whether it was just the expectation of what we got last time, where we got things like Extra Arms and Galaxy and Christology. Like, we got all these insane buffs last time this happened. And now we got Zanish as a comparison. So, I don't know. I guess, like, the main thing of this was to, as Ixar talks about in his AMA, they weren't looking to dramatically change everything, but they were just looking to make, hey, maybe Tidal Surge isn't completely trash, and maybe it's actually like an okay card now, rather than anything that was meant to like push anything super heavily.
Yeah, I think they're intentionally a little bit conservative with both the nerfs and the buffs. Listening or seeing some of the tweets that they put out in the past, and in particular Ixar's Q&A, it seems like they feel that the standard metagame and is in a pretty good spot right now, and to a lesser extent the wild meta. So with a few decks that they seem to be constantly keeping an eye on and monitoring over in the format, I think they're comfortable with where things are right now and didn't want to be too disruptive. I think that the buffs in the past they were well received, but they broke a lot of things, and I think people forget that because it was the first time we had buffs, and I don't think we wanted a repeat of that where we Christology is too good of a card. Like Extra Arms was too good of a card. Luna's Pocket Galaxy was outrageous. So I understand but at the same time there's got to be some middle ground between the two. Where I think that the miss here wasn't that they didn't make cards more powerful, which they objectively did. It's just the cards that they did make powerful or more powerful don't really have a home to be played in, and that you still need 28 more cards to make a deck.
Yeah, I mean, let's go ahead and transition this into Ixar's Q&A because we've been alluding to it a ton. So the question was raised: what does success look like for this latest round of buffs? Right, we're saying that these weren't really a success, but for the dev team, their opinion might be a little bit different, right? So Ixar replied, buffs don't do a very good job at being meta balance fixers, but they give classes a few more options for experimentation and allow for more tools in future card releases. So very similar to what Roffle was alluding to earlier. Success for buffs means that the cards we think make for better play experiences have a higher chance of being used in a deck. Success for nerfs is almost always a meta level change or a population change to a particularly unfun playstyle. I mean, so based upon their definition, I feel like this is exactly what we expected. I'm not surprised by these buffs. I'm a little bit disappointed that they weren't more impactful, but imagine these buffs being impactful in our format. Imagine what they would be doing to standard, I guess,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think this is some good insight, and kind of we touched on this when we were talking about Lilypad Lurker in particular, is that it seemed as though it was a card that was just kind of selected on a whim from the outside, but maybe it's a card that for whatever reason, whether it's future cards or just the concept of Elemental Shaman being something that they want to push, that is a card that they clearly highlighted as something that they wanted to increase the play rate is. But I think what he's referring to about the fact that buffs don't do a good job of being meta balance fixers is what I just mentioned, that you still again need 28 more cards for your deck. So it's that changing one card alone isn't going to increase the win rate of a class archetype deck all that much. unless it's already on the fringe of being playable or viable as is.
Yeah, so like last week we were speculating about nerfs and then buffs, right? But we talked about how buffs are just like throwing darts at a dartboard. Like it's so difficult to predict because of that information imbalance. And in the same way, it's hard to predict whether these buffs are really a success when we have such less information on the dev team, when they know exactly all the future content that's going to be coming out, and they really have a better idea of whether these buffs are successful in the medium to long term compared to the player base, whereas the nerfs are obviously much more apparent. Now, nerfs were kind of on a bit more of an equal playing field with the devs, where we can immediately see whether something was a good or a bad buff, nerf in a lot of ways. Yeah, and buffs are kind of the opposite.
Yeah. I mean, let's transition that, right? We're talking about nerfs. The question was raised about nerfs for Wild, as it almost always is every time we get balance changes. Without a doubt, without fail, we get somebody asking Ixar on the Q&A. So will we see nerfs for Wild? The last set of changes barely did anything. And is there any chance that we can see the card buckets? And I won't talk about the dungeon run aspect of this. But Ixar replies, we want to see the effects of changing Springwater, First Day, and Crabwriter. All were highly played in strong and powerful decks in Wild. After we see how things shake out, I think we'll take a look at the high power decks and see if the resulting meta is acceptable. I'm kind of getting tired of reading these every time we get nerfs because it's the same answer literally every time. I probably have it memorized at this point and don't even need to read off the tweet. But yeah, same old, right?
I would expect the same answer to the same question, though. I think that I don't think it's unreasonable after a wave of 5 nerfs to say, let's see how things shake out. I think the problem is that, like, given the relative light touch to those cards, we aren't going to see much change. So we'll see if they do decide that, in particular, you guys both mentioned that Dark Glare is kind of the subtle winner of these nerfs. If that becomes more prevalent and becomes a bigger problem in the format, that maybe they will that will force their hand.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same question, same answer. I don't have any problem with this, right? Like, nerfs affecting some of the top tier most played decks in Wild. Let's see how things shake out. Mini set coming out. I've definitely become more open and sort of used to the idea that with just how clear Ixar and the bounce team have been about what they see Wild as being, even if I disagree with it, it doesn't really matter because I just know what to expect now. And so I don't really see an answer like this and go like, oh no, I can't believe we're not getting nerfs. No, it's expected, right? Like, this is just in line with their previous statements and they're being consistent in it. So it doesn't surprise me in any way.
Yeah, I think we talked about this when I was guest hosting, but like it is, or even maybe the first time I was on the show as a guest, it seems to be that there's maybe not the same expectation for what the format should be between sort of the highly engaged player base that is on Reddit and on Twitter engaging with this type of Q&A and the development team. And so but that's been consistent. They've been clear about that. And, if nothing else, like, they are more actively communicating and engaging with that community, even if there is a disagreement, like, at the core level of what the format should be.
And then I want to touch on the 1%, right? You mentioned that the 1% super invested player base. So the last question we want to touch on from this Q&A this week was, the question was brought up about the balanced perspective on high level versus pubs, or just kind of your general population player base. And I know this is something that Corbett and I have brought up on the podcast before as well. And so they bring up, related to Hearthstone specifically. So for example, the power level of Rogue and Priest at High Legend versus below, where the general, I think, consensus is Priest is one of the strongest decks in the format in Standard, but overall it's like the 9th best class when you look at just like general HS replay stats on the class. And so it's just a kind of a general game balance issue, though, that the original poster comments on, that they see across genres, right? Like Genji and Overwatch and Medivh and HOTS. Don't really know too much about specifically those, but Ixar talks about the meta at high level tends to trickle down to lower level play over time. So given the choice, we generally balance around high level play. So for example, while we probably don't see something like Ticketus getting nerfed, the statistics we most commonly look at are at top 1% of players. So that kind of confirms that they are looking at the best of the best when they are making their balance decisions, because they ultimately, the changes that the high legend players, make and adapt ultimately trickle down anyways. So that's kind of who they target their nerfs and balance changes at. I also want to comment that this is also probably like, it's so hard to balance between, high level, make everything uber, balanced versus fun. And so they want to keep fun in mind, right? But when they do make balance changes like this, I think it is targeted at the 1%.
Yeah, and it's the first time we've actually seen the team confirm this type of thing, right? Especially the note about the fact that when they're looking at data, they are looking at the top of Legend, not the player base as a whole. And I think that there's kind of been this narrative in the past among high-level players that some of the changes that they do make and have made in the past have been targeted towards a casual audience. And, it's this kind of is in conflict with that sort of presumption that people were making, where this is the type of insight that we didn't get before XR started doing these Q&As, and so it's just interesting and kind of nice to hear.
I mean, it also might warrant or give a little bit of reason rather to why there's so long between wild balance changes, because if they're only looking at the top 1% of players, right, wild is already so much harder to get data for, right? Hence why there's such a long gap between VS reports sometimes. And so getting a significant amount of games in at the top 1% of players in order to make decisions about, this, it kind of makes sense why they have to wait so long. I don't know how.
I think I'd push back on that. I think like a big part of that, I think the wild is unique compared to standard, but I don't think it's like a lack of games is the thing at the top 1%. I think the biggest thing about wild is different than standard is that we're talking about high level play trickling down to low level play. That doesn't happen as much in wild. Like there's a bigger disparity, I think, between the hyper engaged wild player base compared to the very, very casual wild player base. I think there's a less of a dramatic trickle down effect compared to what you see in standard. It still exists, obviously. But like even something like Handbuff Paladin or a Dark Lair Warlock, I find it very unlikely that the like sub diamond players are going to be picking up those decks a ton compared to standard, copying more of what high level players are doing.
I agree. I think that if VS can put together a reasonable amount or reasonable sample over the course of a month or so, with people like opting in to supply their data, I don't see it being difficult for the company that actually like owns that the service and the information associated with that, able to compile all of the data associated with that. So I think that they probably are able to collect it. It's certainly a lower sample than standard just because there are fewer players, but I don't think it's like enough. I don't think it's necessarily limiting. I think it's just that it does take longer for it to trickle down, and it in some cases it doesn't ever make it to the lower levels, more casual player base that maybe is drawn to wild, because I think there is that sort of player that XR always alludes to that does just play wild because they like playing a particular deck, and that player doesn't care what the top 1% of players are doing or what the best deck is. They just want to play Big Priest against you every game.
All right, so I take back my comment about 1% of players. I take it back.
We bullied you out of it.
Bullied me out of it. I overstepped my bounds. I'll take that back.
Outnumbered
2-1. Now that there's actually 3 people, we can actually have votes on
opinions. True. Wow.
True.
Yeah, we can actually do votes.
But we've been going for a little bit here, so I kind of want to wrap it up with just a more general question. What have you guys been trying with the buffs? What have you been playing since the patch, and what have you been enjoying? What have you been having success with? What's your 3 days of post-patch meta been like? What have you been doing?
Honestly, most of the decks that I've been playing haven't really included any of the nerfed or buffed cards just because they are low impact. I did have, I mentioned the deck that I hit Legend with. That didn't run the Razor board just because it, again, dilutes the Death Speaker pool. It was a pretty fun deck. That and honestly, the Reno lock that you built was legitimately one of the more fun decks that I've played that utilized the new cards. It felt good to have a third layer of threats just available to me. There were times where like I sealed games with a Gul'dan in hand just because like I could play two N'Zoths and like win that way. So why waste the Gul'dan in that spot? So a lot of time there's certain matchups where it feels like, against maybe a big priest, you can't match their layers of threats, or you just need to like slam something high impact to seal the game against aggro so that you don't run out of hit points too soon. So like just having that third layer of threat felt pretty good, but I don't think it's a consequence of the card being at 9 mana. It's just the way the deck is built is kind of gives you the option for that.
Yeah, I haven't been trying too much of the new cards. I did obviously play the Reno Lock, and then I played a whole bunch of Glare yesterday, which went horribly. But I've actually been playing a lot of Standard, and using one of the buff cards in Razorboar in Demon Hunter. So I've been playing a lot of like Death Rattle Demon Hunter in Standard, and that's been fun. Sort of trying to mix it up a little bit as we head into the mini set, which should only be they haven't given an official date, but it shouldn't be too long. Should only be like a few weeks, I think, until we start getting some information on that. So even if the buffs and the nerfs this time around weren't the most impactful, a whole bunch of new cards and a whole bunch of new stuff is sort of right around the corner. Not too far away.
Yeah, I've been playing a lot of things. I have not been having success with Arena Locks. My very first stream, I played a lot of Deck of Chaos, a lot of New Zoth, Control Warlock, and New Zoth Arena Lock. And I think that stream I went and combined like 3 and 15. So that was not a lot of fun. I can confirm, by the way, like I have played with 5-mana Deck of Chaos. It is just as garbage as 6-mana Deck of Chaos. Okay, it's not good. Don't do that to yourselves. But then I also played a bunch of like my THL decks. Handbuff Paladin is still like absurdly broken. I've been doing a little bit of the bluegills instead of the Chillblade champions, just so that I can do like double bluegill horse rider, double conviction for the 9 damage buffs.
Because have you heard of the hottest new hand buff tech? Was the sneaky delinquents have been popping up.
Wait, what do those actually do? What are they?
It's the 2-mana 3/1 stealth that puts another like 3/1 stealth in your hand. So the idea is that they work, that there's another resource that gets a card back in your hand, so good with hand buffing. And the stealth is really good with conviction. So that's something that people are just trying if you want to innovate on hand buff, if anyone's listening and wants to try that.
Yeah, it's like a delayed charge, right?
Yeah.
Imagine innovating on a deck that's like perfect, the 30 cards that we currently have. Like, come on.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then I've been playing some good Dark Roulette, so I've been experiencing that Crab Rider is not very good in a lot of decks that aren't Hand Buff Paladin or Murloc Shaman. Like, I played some of that Taxus Paladin, trying to figure out what I want to run off of my Call to Arms, because I have like 6 really good hits, and then trying to figure out the last like 4 or 5 has been really, really hard. You no longer want Crab Rider and Aggro Druid, I think, because when you draw it that's without Embiggen, it feels awful, like in Aggro Druid. So yeah, that's been my experience, playing a lot of decks with Crab Rider that have not been good, and then Hand Buff Paladin, which has been insane. So that's been my experience. But yeah, you guys let us know down in the comments below what you guys have been playing post buff/nerf, post balance patch. What have you guys been playing this week? What's been working? What have you been enjoying? And how do you think that the buffs and nerfs actually are impacting the format? Let us know down in the comments below. That is going to be our episode this week. Roffle and Corbett, thank you so much for joining me today. Corbett, let the people know where they can find you.
Guys, you can find me at Corbett on Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, all the good places. So yeah, come hang out, come join. Thank you very much for listening or watching.
And Roffle, where can they find you?
At Roffle on Twitch and YouTube, and then at RoffleHS on Instagram and Twitter.
Yep, and you can find me on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, at GetMeOut. We appreciate all of you guys for tuning in this week. Appreciate you guys coming back week after week. We have some exciting news. I can promise. I've been saying this, but we're finally close to announcing some stuff coming soon. So soon TM, right? But yeah, stay tuned for all of that. We really do appreciate you guys watching. We hope you guys are enjoying the post balance patch meta, and we will see you guys next week. Later.